Please, I am not your enemy." The rancher stared, then defied his code. For an Apache girl, John Cooper had lived his whole life following a code. A man's word was his bond, and a man had to protect his own land, his own people, and his own beliefs, no matter the cost. He had worked hard to build his ranch in the dusty, dry deserts of Arizona, and it had become a symbol of his life's work. His land was everything. He had heard the whispers of Apache raids, heard the stories of battles fought and lives lost. In his world, the Apache were always the enemy, painted as savages who would stop at nothing to take what was not theirs. That was the world John knew, and it was the world he trusted. But everything changed one fateful evening. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. John was riding along the edge of his property, the reins of his horse steady in his hand, when he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At first, he thought it was an animal, lying motionless in the tall grass near a small creek that ran through the land. But as he got closer, he realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a girl. Her face was dirty, her clothes torn, and blood stained the ground beneath her. She was lying there, unconscious, barely breathing, but alive. For a moment, John's mind raced. He was a rancher, a man who lived by the principles of hard work and survival. He had no reason to get involved in whatever had happened to her. He glances around in despair. She could be one of them, one of the Apache. What if she was a scout, sent to spy on his land? What if she was bait to lure him into a trap? His hand instinctively reached for the rifle strapped to his saddle. But something stopped him. It wasn't just the fact that she was so young, barely older than a child, but the look on her face. The pain, the fear, the helplessness. It struck him in a way he couldn't explain. His heart seemed to stop for a moment. Here was a person, a living, breathing human being, in need of help. John dismounted his horse slowly, his boots making soft thuds on the earth. His hands still rested on the rifle, but his feet carried him forward as though he were being pulled by an unseen force. He knelt beside the girl, examining her carefully. She was an Apache. There was no denying that. Her features were sharp, her skin sun-kissed from the desert, her black hair tangled with dirt. But that didn't matter now. Breaths. All that mattered was that she was hurt. "Please," she whispered, barely audible, her voice raspy and weak.
"I am not your enemy."
John froze. Her words seemed to echo in the stillness of the desert night. She spoke in broken English, but the sincerity in her voice was undeniable. He didn't know if she was trying to trick him, or if she truly meant what she said. But something in him stirred, a feeling he couldn't ignore. John's instincts told him to walk away, to leave her to whatever fate awaited her. After all, she was the enemy, wasn't she? But something deeper inside him rebelled against that thought. Was she really the enemy? Was it possible that everything he had been taught about the Apache people was wrong? Could a young girl, barely able to stay awake, be a threat? He had to make a choice. The world he had lived in, the world of ranchers and soldiers, settlers and traders, had always been divided between us and them. But in that moment, as he looked down at the Apache girl, he felt that line blur. John glanced around, his mind whirling. The sun was nearly gone, and darkness was settling in. He couldn't leave her here. He couldn't just walk away from someone who needed help, no matter who she was. Without thinking, he carefully scooped her up into his arms. She was light, almost fragile, and as he carried her back to his ranch, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. When he reached his cabin, he laid her on the bed. The place was modest, Just a small room with a fire burning in the hearth and the smell of wood and leather filling the air. John moved quickly, gathering water, cloths, and anything he could find to clean the girl's wounds. Breath. His hands trembled as he worked, unsure of what he was doing but determined to help. Hours passed, and he finally managed to stop the bleeding and bind her injuries. But she didn't wake up. Her breathing was shallow, and John sat by her side, watching over her through the night. As the moonlight streamed through the window, John's mind wandered. He thought about the stories he had heard, the warnings about the Apache. He remembered the bloodshed, the fear, the hatred that had been passed down from one generation to the next. But here, in his cabin, with this girl lying unconscious before him, all of that seemed so far away. He could no longer see her as the enemy. John didn't know what was happening to him, but he couldn't turn back now. He had made his choice. He had chosen to help her. And with that decision, everything about the world he had known was starting to unravel. Breaks. Hours turned into days, and as the girl slowly regained consciousness, John could feel something shifting within him. Her name was Tansy, she told him, and she was a part of the Apache people. Brask. She spoke quietly, her voice still weak, but there was a calmness in her words that soothed him. She was not a warrior.
She was not a threat. She was just a girl struggling to survive in a world that had never been kind to her.
And in that moment, John realized something he had never considered before. Maybe it wasn't just the Apache who were the enemy. Maybe it was the hatred, the fear, the prejudice that had been passed down through the generations. Maybe those were the real enemies. Breath.
As the days passed, John's perspective shifted. He found himself drawn to Tansy in ways he couldn't explain.
Perhaps. She was quiet, reserved, but there was a strength in her, a quiet resilience that spoke to him on a deeper level. She didn't hate him for what he was, for what his people had done to hers. She didn't judge him, even though she had every right to. And that was something John could not ignore. His heart, once hardened by years of distrust and fear, began to soften. Tansy wasn't his enemy. She never had been. But could he change the way he had been taught to see the world? Would he defy everything he had ever believed in for the sake of this girl? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain. The rancher had already begun to change, whether he was ready for it or not. As the days passed, John Cooper found himself in a position he never thought he would be in. Tansy, the Apache girl he had found lying in the dirt, was now recovering under his roof. It wasn't just the physical wounds that troubled him. It was the emotional ones that were harder to heal. But each day she grew stronger, and something deep inside him began to change. John had always lived by a strict code. He had been raised to see the Apache as the enemy, dangerous, ruthless, and always ready to fight. His father had told him stories of the battles they fought, the lives lost, and how the Apache would never stop their raids. Those stories had shaped John's life, had shaped the way he saw the world. But looking at Tansy, he began to question everything he had been taught. Tansy wasn't like the Apache he had imagined. She wasn't a warrior with a fierce glare or a bloodthirsty heart. She was just a girl, soft-spoken, kind, and full of sorrow for her people. When she was well enough, she would sit by the fire and speak quietly, telling John of her family, of her tribe, and of the world she had left behind. The more John listened, the more his heart softened. She spoke of the land where her people lived, of the rivers that ran clear and the mountains that rose high into the sky. She talked about her mother and father, both lost to the wars that had ravaged their people for years. She told him of the constant struggle, of the fear that never left. And yet, despite all that, there was no bitterness in her voice. It struck John deeply. Here she was, someone who had lost everything, and yet she spoke with such calm, such dignity. She didn't seem to hate him, even though his people had taken so much from hers. That was the most surprising thing of all. John had expected anger. He had expected her to be resentful, maybe even vengeful. But that wasn't the woman sitting before him. No, Tansy was something different. The way she looked at him with those dark eyes, as if seeing through all the layers of his rough exterior, made him uneasy. It wasn't just the physical healing that made him uneasy. It was the growing realization that his world was being turned upside down. He spent his days working on the ranch, fixing fences, tending to the cattle, and doing the usual chores that filled his life with meaning. But each evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself sitting by the fire with Tansy, listening to her stories. He couldn't explain it, but something about her presence comforted him. It was as if the harshness of the desert was lessened when she was near. One evening after a long day of work, John sat with Tansy outside, staring at the stars above. The cool desert air was refreshing after the heat of the day. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The land, your people, your family?" Tansy turned her head toward him, her face soft, but filled with the weight of memories.
I miss them every day, she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
But I also know they are at peace now. The war has taken so much from us, John. My people, our way of life, it's fading away. John didn't know what to say to that. He couldn't understand it fully, but he could hear the sadness in her voice. The sadness for something lost, something gone forever. "Do you think we'll ever be able to stop the fighting?" John asked, his words hanging in the air. Tansy was silent for a moment, and when she spoke, it was with a quiet, calm certainty.
"I don't know, but I hope."
"Hope is all we have left."
Those words stayed with John long after the conversation ended.
Hope. It seemed so simple, yet so powerful. In a world full of bitterness and hatred, hope was something that could change everything.
He had never thought much about hope.
His life had always been about survival, about keeping his land, his cattle, his life. But Tansy had given him something to think about. John found himself questioning more than just the Apache. He began to question the life he had built, the life he had taken for granted. Had he been wrong all this time? Had he been blind to the humanity of the people he had been taught to hate? But days continued to pass, and John's heart grew heavier with the weight of his thoughts. He had started to feel something for Tansy.
It wasn't just pity. It wasn't just sympathy for her pain.
It was something deeper, something that reached past the hatred and the division that had defined his life up until now. One morning as John was feeding the horses, he found himself lost in thought. He was aware of the world around him, the rustling of the wind, the distant calls of the birds, the feel of the reins in his hands. But his mind was on Tansy. What would happen if the people from town found out he had been sheltering her? What would happen if the soldiers came looking for her? Would he have the courage to protect her, to keep her safe, even if it meant going against everything he had been taught?
John knew that in the world he lived in, helping Tansy would make him a traitor.
It would make him an enemy of the very people he had called friends, but in his heart he couldn't bring himself to care. He had made his choice when he decided to help her, and there was no turning back now. But still, doubts lingered in his mind. But could he truly protect her? Could he keep her safe from the world that would never accept her? Bank. As the days turned into weeks, John realized that his feelings for Tansy were no longer just about saving her from the danger she had faced. It was about something far more complicated. It was about the deep connection they had formed, a bond that was impossible to ignore. John's life was no longer just about survival. It was about something deeper, something that reached beyond land and cattle. It was about a woman who had shown him the power of hope, the power of forgiveness, and the power of a heart that refused to hate. But there was still one question lingering in John's mind, one that he couldn't shake. Would the world ever allow them to be together?
Would they ever be able to find peace in a world that had taught them to hate each other? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain. The journey John had begun, the journey with Tansy, was only just beginning.
The sun had barely risen when John Cooper heard the first knock at his door. It was early, earlier than usual, and the stillness of the desert morning felt broken by the sound of heavy boots outside. But he had just finished his breakfast, a simple meal of beans and coffee, when he stood up and walked to the door. When he opened it, his heart sank. Standing before him were a few of the men from town, ranchers and settlers who had known John for years. They were dressed in the same clothes they always wore, worn-out boots and wide-brimmed hats, but today their faces were set with grim determination. Their eyes, hard as the desert rocks, studied him as if he had done something wrong. "Morning, John," said Tom Sullivan, the leader of the group. He was a tall, broad man with a thick beard and a voice that always sounded like it belonged to someone used to giving orders. "Morning, Tom," John replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. Something was wrong. "We need to talk," Tom said, his voice taking on a serious tone. "It's about the Apache girl. We know she's here." John's heart skipped a beat. The Apache girl. Tansy. John had known this moment would come, but he had hoped it wouldn't be so soon. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he could keep her safe a little longer, but there was no denying the truth any longer. His actions had been noticed, and the consequences were now catching up with him. John glanced over his shoulder, his eyes flicking to the small cabin where Tansy was staying. She was still sleeping, her face peaceful, unaware of the trouble that was heading their way. But his mind raced. What should he do? Should he lie? Should he deny everything? But deep down he knew the truth could not be hidden forever. "John," Tom continued, his voice lower now, more urgent. "We need to take her back. It's the law. She's a threat to all of us. She's Apache, and we can't let them slip through our fingers again." Desk. "You've got to turn her over." John's stomach churned. The law. That word meant something entirely different to John than it did to these men. For them, the law was clear. Keep the Apache under control. Keep them out. Keep them away. They saw them as nothing more than a danger. But John had seen something in Tansy that had begun to change the way he thought. She wasn't a threat. She was just a girl, lost and broken, trying to survive in a world that had never been kind to her.
"I can't do that," John said, his voice firmer than he felt.
"She's not a threat." Tom's eyebrows furrowed. "She's Apache, John."
You know what that means. You've got to see reason."
"I'm not blind to what's happened in the past," John said, his voice hardening. "But Tansy's not like the others."
"She's not like them." The other men exchanged glances, their faces filled with confusion and disbelief. They couldn't understand.
They couldn't see what John saw, the quiet strength in her, the way she had never once shown an ounce of malice. They only saw the color of her skin, the fact that she was Apache, and in their minds that was all that mattered. Tom stepped forward. his expression hardening.
You're making a mistake, John.
Narration. Big one. If you don't turn her over, you're going to have a lot more trouble than just us. Best, you'll have the whole town against you. The threat hung in the air like a heavy fog. Breaths. John felt the weight of it press down on him, but still, he didn't back down. He couldn't. I'm not turning her over, John said, his voice firm now. She's under my protection, and that's where she'll stay. There was a long silence as the men stood there, clearly shocked by his refusal. Tom's jaw tightened, and he exchanged a few more glances with the others. John could tell they were weighing their options, deciding whether or not they would force him to comply. But John didn't flinch, though he could feel the tension in his bones. He had made his decision. He wouldn't let them take her. Not without a fight. Finally, Tom spoke again, his voice cold. Then you leave us no choice. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what they were planning. But he knew one thing. They wouldn't just walk away. The town was filled with people who shared their views, who would stand with them. John was alone in this. If it came to a fight, he would be standing against the very people he had known all his life. He stood in the doorway, watching the men for a moment longer, then said, I won't let you take her. You'll have to go through me. Tom studied him for a moment before shaking his head slowly. You're making a big mistake, John. A dangerous one. With that, the men turned and walked away, their heavy footsteps fading into the distance. But John didn't feel relieved. He knew this was far from over. They would come back, and next time, they wouldn't be as easy to send away. The tension between them had been set, and now John knew he had no choice but to prepare for whatever was coming next. John turned back to his cabin, his mind racing. He had no idea how he would keep Tansy safe. Burrs. He wasn't a fighter, and he didn't want violence to be the answer. But the threat was real. He had made an enemy of the men from town, and worse, he had made an enemy of the very system that had been in place for generations. But when he entered the cabin, everything felt different. Patsy was still asleep, her breathing steady. She didn't know the danger that was now surrounding them. She didn't know the weight of what John had just promised, and yet John couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. For first time in his life, he had defied everything he had been taught to do. He had made a stand for what he believed in. He had chosen to protect her, no matter the cost. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, John couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming. A storm that would test everything he had fought for, everything he had ever known. Days turned into weeks, and the tension around John Cooper's ranch continued to build. The men from town hadn't given up, and neither had the rest of the community. Word had spread about the Apache girl, about John's refusal to hand her over. The ranchers, the traders, even some of the farmers, everyone had their opinion, and most were against him. It wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It had become a battle of ideals. For the people in town, John's actions were a betrayal. They saw the Apache as a threat, and John, a man they had known for years, was now standing on the wrong side of that line. One afternoon, as John was working on the fence line near his barn, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the rifle that was slung across his shoulder. But as the rider came into view, John saw it was not just one man. It was Tom Sullivan, leading a small group of men from town. They had come again! John's breath caught in his throat. This time he knew they wouldn't back down. He had been hoping they would relent, but deep inside he knew that hope was fading fast. They were done talking. It was no longer about reason or understanding. It was about control. And now John was standing in their way. Tom pulled his horse to a stop in front of John. The men behind him dismounted quickly, their eyes hard, their movements tense. "I told you before, John," Tom said, his voice sharp. "You're making a dangerous mistake. This has gone too far." "I've made my decision," John replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not turning her over." Tom's gaze darkened. "You think you can protect her from all of us? You think you can stand against the whole town?" "I'm not asking for the whole town's support," John said quietly, looking at Tom. "I'm doing what I believe is right." Tom took a step forward, his voice lowering, full of frustration. "What you believe is right." "What about the safety of everyone else? What about the families here?"
You think they're just gonna let this go? The law doesn't care what you believe, John.
"But the law is what keeps us safe." John's jaw tightened. The law. He had heard that word so many times in the past few days, but he had come to realize that the law wasn't always just. It wasn't always right. The law had never been fair to the Apache, never seen their humanity, never cared about their survival. And yet now, John was supposed to follow it blindly? He couldn't do that. Bah.
Not anymore. You want me to hand her over? John said, looking Tom in the eye.
"But I won't. She's not a threat." Breath. "She's just a girl trying to survive." Tom shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Ravens. You're still seeing her as a girl, aren't you?" "She's Apache, John. She's part of a people who have been raiding our land, killing our people. How many more of them do you think we'll let slip through our fingers?" "You're not seeing the bigger picture." John's heart pounded in his chest. He had always seen the Apache as enemies. He had grown up with those stories, those warnings, and they had shaped his view of the world. But Tansy had changed all that. She had shown him a different side of the Apache people, one that wasn't defined by violence, but by survival. "Purse. I've seen the bigger picture, Tom," John said, his voice steady. "And I've made my choice. I'm not handing her over." There was a long pause, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Then Tom spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. "You know what this means, don't you?" "You're forcing our hand. If you won't give her to us, we'll take matters into our own hands." John's chest tightened. He could feel the threat in Tom's words, and he knew it wasn't an empty one. The town had rallied against him. If they couldn't get Tansy peacefully, they would take her by force. John had no illusions about what they were capable of. He knew it was only a matter of time before they acted. "I'm not afraid of you," John said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm not afraid of what you'll do. But you're making a mistake, a big one." Tom's face darkened, and he glanced at the other men who stood behind him, patient. John could see the hesitation in their eyes. They were a part of this, but there was something in their faces that suggested they weren't entirely sure about what they were doing. They had come for Tansy, but John could see that some of them weren't entirely comfortable with the situation. "I don't want bloodshed, Tom," John continued, his voice softer now. "But I will protect her. I will protect her with my life if I have to." Tom's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by someone he had considered a friend. "This isn't over, John."
"You'll see."
With that, Tom turned his horse and began to ride away, signaling for the others to follow. As they left, John watched them go, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. He had made his stand, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. John stood there for a long while, his mind racing. He had chosen to protect Tansy, and now he would have to face whatever came next. The town, the people he had known, were turning against him. But in his heart, John knew he couldn't back down. He had made a promise, and he would keep it, no matter the cost. Later that evening, as the sun set and the sky turned dark, John sat in the cabin deep in thought. Tansy was inside, resting quietly, unaware of the storm brewing outside. John didn't want her to worry. She had been through enough, but the reality of what was coming hit him like a blow to the chest, where he could feel it in his bones. The anger, the fear, the tension that was slowly but surely tightening around him. He couldn't let them take her.
He wouldn't let them. John knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy.
He would have to make tough choices, face challenges he wasn't prepared for. But in that moment he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let the world tell him who his enemies were anymore. The night felt heavier than usual, a dark shroud settling over the ranch. John Cooper sat by the fire in his cabin, staring into the flames, his thoughts consumed by everything that had happened. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn. The quiet rancher who had always been so sure of his place in the world was now caught in the middle of something far greater than himself. The sun had set hours ago, and with it any hope that things might return to normal. The townspeople weren't backing down. John knew that now. They had made it clear in their last visit. If he wouldn't turn over Tansy willingly, they would force him to. He had stood his ground, but the reality of what that meant began to sink in. It wasn't just the men from town who were becoming a problem. Word had spread quickly, and now there were whispers of soldiers coming from the nearby fort, eager to bring down the law and take care of the Apache problem. John couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about Tansy anymore. It was about him, too. He had defied the unwritten rules of the land, rules that had been in place long before he had ever come to live here.
He stood up from his chair, pacing the small cabin.
He didn't want Tansy to hear his worry. She had already been through too much, and the last thing she needed was for him to show any fear. But it was impossible to ignore the truth. If he didn't act soon, they would come for her, and he would be powerless to stop them. Tansy was still asleep, her small form tucked into the bed across the room. She was unaware of the mounting danger outside, the growing storm that was closing in on them both. John could see the peaceful expression on her face, and it broke his heart. More than this, more than the fear and the bloodshed that seemed to follow her wherever she went. As he watched her, John realized just how much he had come to care for her. It was more than just a feeling of duty now. She had become more than a stranger he had found on the side of the road. She was no longer just an Apache girl. She was someone who had touched his heart, someone he felt responsible for, someone he couldn't imagine losing. He walked over to the window and looked out at the dark landscape. The moon was high in the sky, casting its pale light over the desert. The wind was still, and the only sound was the faint rustling of the trees in the distance. But underneath that quiet, John could feel the tension in the air. It was the calm before the storm. He could feel the weight of what was coming, and it made him uneasy. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed conflict. He had always preferred the solitude of the land, the quiet work of tending to his cattle and crops. But now, he was being forced into a battle he hadn't asked for. He was being forced to choose between what was right and what was easy, and that choice was weighing heavily on him. John knew that if the soldiers came, there would be no easy way out. He couldn't just stand there and let them take her. But What could he do? He didn't have the resources to fight an army. He didn't have the training or the manpower to stand against the law. His only advantage was that he knew the land, and that wasn't enough. Not this time. The door creaked open behind him, and John turned quickly. Tansy was standing in the doorway, her dark eyes wide and uncertain. She had woken up, sensing the change in the air. "John?" She asked softly, her voice still weak but steady. "What's wrong? You look troubled." John took a deep breath and tried to push aside the anxiety gnawing at him. He couldn't burden her with his fears. He had to be strong for her, even if he didn't know how to protect her. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about things." Tansy stepped into the room, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his arm. "You don't need to hide it, John. I can see it in your eyes." "What's happening? What are you so afraid of?" John sighed, his shoulders slumping. He hadn't realized how much she could read him, how much she understood. She had been through so much, and yet here she was, trying to comfort him. It only made his heart ache more. "The men from town. They're not going to stop," he said quietly. "They want you, Tansy. They want me to hand you over." Tansy's expression didn't change. "Oh." She stood there, her hand still resting on his arm, her gaze unwavering. She didn't look scared or angry. She looked resigned. "I know," she said softly. Breath. "I knew this would happen, but I can't go back to them, John." "I can't go back to that life. I'd rather die first." John's heart tightened at the words. He hadn't realized just how much fear she was carrying inside. She had already lost so much, and now she was being asked to face even more. But he couldn't allow that. "Not on his watch. I won't let that happen," John said, his voice firm. "Promise you, Tansy, I will protect you, no matter what." Tansy looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "How can you protect me, John? How can you protect yourself from them?" "The soldiers? The town?" John looked at her, a deep sense of determination rising within him. "He don't know yet. But I won't give up."
"I won't give you up." For the first time since this all began, Tansy allowed herself a small smile, a flicker of hope in her eyes.
She squeezed his arm gently and nodded.
"I believe you,"
she said, her voice soft but sincere.
"You've already done more for me than anyone ever has. I trust you."
And with those words, something inside John changed. It was as if all the weight he had been carrying, fear, doubt, uncertainty, fell away. He had made a promise, and he would keep it. He would find a way to protect her. He didn't know how, but he would. As the night stretched on, John sat down at the table, his mind racing with ideas. He had to act quickly, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He had to find a way to stand against the town and the soldiers, to fight for what he believed in. He had no experience with fighting, but he knew the land. He knew how to survive in this desert. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The fire in the hearth crackled as the night wore on, but John's mind was clear. He was ready for what was coming. He would stand tall for Tansy. for what was right.